Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome again to the Lubar Center at Marquette University Law School, Eckstein Hall. I'm Mike Goucher, and this is On the Issues. This is our continuing series of conversations with news and policymakers, people we like to say are doing interesting and important work in this region and beyond. Today we are joined by Anna Clark. She is the author of this book I hold in my hand, The Poison City, Flint's Water and the American Urban Tragedy. Anna is a journalist who lives right now in the city of Detroit. She has written over the years for Elle Magazine, for the New York Times, for the Washington Post, for Politico, Columbia Journalism Review, Next City. Have I left anything off, or is that pretty much?
There's more, but
okay, there's more. All right. This book, The Poison City, has received very strong reviews. The San Francisco Chronicle called Poison City an exceptional work of journalism. USA Today said it's hard to overstate just how important Anna Clark's new book is. And the New York Times called Poison City a comprehensive chronicle of the crisis with an eye for the institutional corruption and indifference that enabled it. Anna Clark is here today at Marquette University for a series of events. It's part of our Democracy in Troubled Times series. We are delighted to have her with us. Won't you please give Anna Clark a warm welcome to the law school. Good to have you with us.
Thank you.
Welcome. We saved our best weather just for you. But she's from Detroit, so she knows. It's not a big deal.
I feel right at home, you guys.
So let's talk about the origins of this book, because I think most of the people in this room probably have some idea of what happened in Flint, but clearly you felt there was more to the story, more that people needed to know. Why did you decide to write this book?
Because there is more. What happened in the city of Flint is had a moment where it was everywhere, right? You know, you saw it in the headlines all the time. And what I felt was that even in longer form articles, there was a lot of context that was missing. I felt like if we were going to tell this story, not only did we need to find a way to bring clarity to the sequence of events that immediately led to this citywide drinking water emergency, but also the historic context for like what were the choices made over decades that put this city in a position that something like this could happen.
Describe Flint for us in 2014, the time this all really begins. Most people are familiar with Flint's history to some degree. It was a large part of the auto manufacturing boom, but by 2014, things had changed.
It had changed. So the city of Flint, it's the birthplace of General Motors. It has a lot in common with Milwaukee. It was a city that had, where its population had grown really, really fast over the first half of the 20th century. It was a destination for the Great Migration a little bit later, kind of like Milwaukee, because there are other larger cities just south that were acting as sponges. But yeah, so there was a lot of changing demographics in the city. They had, but like what had happened over the second half of the 20th century is that, you know, for a number of reasons, it was losing both industry, famously General Motors, but not only, and it was losing people. So the city in 2014 had about less than half the population it had in the 1960s when it was at its peak, when it felt like it was going to be continuing to grow forever and ever. And that meant that there was a tremendous amount of vacancy. It meant that because it was mostly white people who left, it was a disproportionately community of color, particularly African Americans, and it was one of the poorest cities in the country. It had a 40% poverty rate. And it also had, despite being a Great Lakes city right near, you know, Lake Huron, it's an hour's drive from Lake Huron, it had some of the most expensive water bills in the country.
I was struck by that. Tell people in this audience how much the typical customer would pay a month for water in Flint, Michigan.
So for water and sewer, the bills the average we're hitting about almost like $140, which is crazy, even before you're accounting for the fact that they're under-resourced.
Great Lakes bill.
I know, right? Like a lot of us think, you know, like basic economics, sort of supply and demand, you'd think that in a city rich with water, it has, you know, besides the river and the Saginaw Bay and Lake Huron and stuff like that, you think that it would it doesn't seem intuitive that it would be so expensive to access, but it was. And because so many people could not afford their bills, it was a crisis before the water crisis, right? There was a spate of shutoffs that was threatening a different kind of public health crisis, just sanitation, access to drinking water. There were a lot of prosecutions for what was called water theft, people doing illegal hookups to access water, and people, desperately wanted to change. It had been getting its water from the Detroit drinking water system for many decades at that point. The water quality was great.
It's from Lake Huron, the water.
Yep, and it was coming treated, and the city was distributing it. The quality was very good, but the bills were very expensive. And while it wasn't solely related to the contract with Detroit, there were some genuine challenges in trying to lower people's bills.
Well, this is a good point to start telling the story of the poisoning of the water in Flint, because the cost of water did play a role in this. Flint decided it was going to go a different path and create its own water authority, essentially. And so in the spring of 2014, Flint flips a switch and says that's the end of the water from Detroit and from Lake Huron, and we're going to, while we build or get our new treatment facility ready, we're going to use Flint River water. Was it just about cost, or was there more to that decision?
That's an interesting question that I think is literally still being investigated right now, because there's a lot, when you look back at the time, there's a lot that doesn't make sense about why this choice was made. So one important thing to put out there is the city was under emergency management in 2014. So emergency management in Michigan is, it's a state law where for extremely distressed cities and school districts, a state-appointed official, administrator, can come in and basically hold sole political control. So in Flint, that meant that there was an elected mayor and city council, but they only had as much power as this emergency manager decided to give them.
Which wasn't much.
Which was, and as much pay or anything. Truly the only person who had authority to make any choices was this emergency manager. And what's more, they had powers that were more broad than even the mayor and council's office. They could unilaterally make or break union contracts, for example. They had access to different tools. The defense of this system, which is very controversial in Michigan, is that you need to bring in somebody from the outside with no political ties or anything like that to just get things in order, because it's a real crisis. But what happened in Flint is that, and in other places too in Michigan, is that when you put that level of authority in a single person, and it's sort of unending, it can go on and on and on. It can, challenging things can happen. There's no accountability when things go wrong. So in April of 2014, this drinking water switch happened. The decision was made by the emergency manager to make this switch and to specifically to use the Flint River drinking water source as an interim drinking water solution for a couple years. Mm-hmm. We'll reboot our old plant, we'll use the drinking water from our own river, and at the end of the couple years, we'll join this brand new system that's under construction right now. We'll still have to treat the water, but it'll be Great Lakes water. It'll be a little easier to do. And the pitch was that this would save the city a great deal of money. One reason why this is a little bit confusing is that it's not totally clear how it would do so, because you're basically building an entirely new water system in your own city, rebooting the own plant. You're financing a third of the construction cost of that new one you want to join, and people's water bills went up. They didn't go down, they went up. They went up. Soon after the switch happened, the emergency manager signed a 2-year budget that was taking people's water rates up another 12%. So it's very, when you look back at it, you're like, what is actually going on here? I spent a lot of time with this. It still confuses me.
So what was very interesting, though, is within 4 or 5 weeks, you had people in Flint complaining
Yes.
about the water. What kind of complaints were they getting very early into
Very
this
early on.
changeover?
The earliest, and these were complaints that were reported. Like there's local news outlets that were covering this. People's earliest complaints were that it felt and tasted strange. It felt odd on their skin. Some of that would be expected. It is a different water supply, but. It bothered people to the point that they were not just delivering their complaints to reporters who would ask them about it, but even reaching out, some reached out even to the state environmental officials, even the EPA, to just register. They're like something's odd about this. It doesn't feel right. It doesn't taste right. I'm not sure I trust it. I don't feel comfortable with this.
And what they found out later, and this was not known to the public at the time, they found out later that there were some problems with the water. They had not been using something called corrosion control.
Right.
And this is something that, for example, in the city of Milwaukee, there is corrosion control, but in Flint there was not. Why did they not do that? Something that would obviously knock down lead levels.
Why didn't they do it? Well, it was breaking federal law, so
That's
they should have done it.
Broken, yeah.
There was a number of problems with the water switch. One is that the city plant didn't receive the kind of upgrades it needed to treat the water safely. It didn't have the staffing in neither numbers nor training to treat the water safely. And also, it didn't have corrosion control, which is what you're supposed to add to the water in order to help keep our aging infrastructure from breaking down into it, right? We have old pipes all over America. Lead pipes especially are a reason of concern. So in lieu of a massive infrastructure investment to replace them, which would be great, you're supposed to add corrosion control at the treatment plant so that when the water passes through, it doesn't, it can help, it creates a scale that can help keep those metals away from our drinking water supply by the time it gets to our tap. With Flint, by switching to the river water, which is much healthier than it gets credit for sometimes, it has improved over the decades, but it is a more corrosive water source, and you're not adding corrosion control, which means that over time it starts corroding more and more and more. And when you see people eventually showing water bottles with brown or orange or discolored water, that was iron. That was iron that was breaking down as rust. That was showing up in people's water. Lead was not visible, but was also present.
There were some hints that something was not working right. You had the bacteria issues in the water. And then the one that I did not know about until I read Anna's book was that GM, which was still manufacturing vehicles in the Flint area, they used a lot of Flint water in the manufacturing process, and all of a sudden in January of, I think, 2015, they stopped using Flint water.
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah, this is remarkable. So the switch happened in April of 2014. There's a series of boil water advisories because of E. coli bacteria in the late summer. That was also kind of worrying people. It was in October of 2014, so only 5 months after the switch, that this huge engine plant that's still in the city of Flint said this pipe is corroding our machinery. And while they tried to adapt, they tried to dilute it with water that they were trucking in from Detroit. They tried other things. They're like, we can't do this anymore. We want to leave the Flint water system. We want to hook onto a nearby suburb that's still getting its Detroit water from Detroit. This was sent off some local alarm bells, as you would expect. People were worried about the lost revenue from GM paying its water bills into the system. They were worried about, and residents, of course, are worried about if it's not okay for these machines, why is it okay for me? But they were told, again and again and again by environmental officials, by everybody, by just again and again and again, people insisted it is safe for you to drink. It might not be fine for what they were presenting as, this sort of delicate technical work, has more sensitive needs, but stick with us, it's fine, the water's safe, we'll continue to improve it, da-da-da.
I was struck, I think you said that literally GM was saying this is rusting our crankshafts.
Yeah.
The cars were building.
Because it was corroding it, right? Like it doesn't have corrosion. That's like it's very intuitive. And well, I didn't know this. I learned a lot while I was working on this and just following the story. But like when I talk to anybody who's in the like water treatment business, I mean, it's not rocket science. You know, this is a pretty like you can see the signs.
So word spreads, I'm sure, about that in the Flint area. Flint residents begin to hear of what GM is no longer doing, and that is using Flint water. So you write about a big, essentially, community meeting that was held in, I think, January of 2015. Yep. I got my dates right there.
That's right.
And there were a lot of people in that room, people who were Flint residents who said, this is not right. There are issues here. We need to go back to using the water that was supplied to us from Detroit. What were they told by the emergency manager at the time?
That they're exaggerating, it wasn't that big of a deal, and even to the point of implying that they're making things up, you know, like faking the water, like that's not your real water, says one mother says she was told when she brought some from her kitchen sink. This community meeting, it happened, there had also been yet another like red flag, which was this residents got a notice that the city was in violation of the Safe Drinking Water Act for having too much of something that's called as an acronym TTHMs, which is a chlorine disinfection byproduct that can be a carcinogen, you know, especially if taken in large quantities over a long time. They basically, after the E. coli problem, they started adding more chlorine and so much chlorine that was causing more, you know, it's just a cycle of problems. Anyway, so that notice, in addition to all the other things that had been going on, like people had really had it, and they were beginning to notice more and more problems, you know, within their own homes, like the discolored water out of their faucet, rashes. Some people said that like hair loss was a thing.
You know,
yeah, like eyelashes. Like they're like what? It, like didn't necessarily all know it was going to the water, but like we're beginning talking to each other, beginning to map things out, kind of bring things together. They're beginning to be like, this. We need to go back to Detroit. We need, like, this is like a public health problem. But so they brought together some environmental officials from the agency and other folks who are working on it, and it was a very rowdy meeting that nobody went away from feeling good about. But yeah, like the argument was that we absolutely cannot go back to Detroit water. It's impossible, it's too expensive. And they were also like really leaning on the idea that like Detroit kicked us off the water. Like they said that after we notified them that we were going to join this brand new water system, we weren't going to keep renewing, you know, our little short-term contract, that they just kicked us off and we had to do something for these 2 years. It was our only choice. But that wasn't true. There were other communities, little suburbs in the area that were in the same situation. They were also going to move to the new water system, and they didn't have an active contract. They just kept paying their bills to Detroit, and it was fine. Like the city wasn't going to turn off the water, right? So I think they were trying to deflect, the emergency managers in particular, trying to deflect responsibility, saying it wasn't our fault, they made us do this. We have no choice, we have to just get through it.
The residents were persistent, though. You talk about one of them in the book. Leanne Walters became sort of the face of this water crisis in Flint. She was dogged in her determination. I mean, she collected her own samples. She reached out to others who she thought might be more willing to listen to what she was experiencing.
Right. And this is something I think that's like so important, and that sometimes gets lost in like, you know, kind of shorter dispatches about the water crisis, is how much community organizing played a role in making this a thing that we're talking about to this day. I mean, they were dismissed over and over and over, and journalists who were reporting on it, you know, were in in a position where some people are saying one thing, the experts are saying the other thing, and you know, the story was just kind of stagnating. It wasn't clear how anything was going to break through to create some kind of change, even though it seemed to be escalating as a crisis. So Leanne and a number of other people in the community drawing from what I would argue is like a very strong history of activism in the community. This like union town, right? You know, like they did a great deal of organizing themselves to start researching what was going on, trying to figure out what the treatment was, mapping symptoms to see if they could see patterns, going to Lansing to lobby officials to talk to them directly, to show them pictures that they were documenting, and reaching out to outsiders who they hoped could help them, like validate what they're saying, do some independent investigation. Even before Virginia Tech came there, they were reaching out to like Bob Bocock, who's like a guy who works with like Aaron Brockovich, you know, like they're trying to reach out to environmental justice heroes, you know, basically throughout history to be like, what can we do? What should we do? How do we look into this? It was very strategic, in addition to like a series of very public demonstrations and campaigns.
You mentioned Virginia Tech, and let me pick up on that because you're talking about Mark Edwards, who's a professor of engineering. He's been to this law school to talk about the issue of lead and water. And so Leanne Walters is able to reach out to him, and he decides he wants to take a look at a larger sample, maybe 300 test kits distributed. People could, you know, as many who wanted to take part, and many did. And then they would take a look at what they were dealing with. In there. Give us a sense of his role in this.
Sure. Yeah, it was she was able to connect with him by way of Miguel del Toro, who was at the EPA in Chicago. He was somebody who did you know, a great deal of research on her particular home. Like basically this was she used to joke a little bit about how it became like kind of a ground zero house. She had an unusually long lead line, and their house had just a ridiculous amount of lead, you know, that with the help of, you know, Mark Edwards and Virginia Tech, some of the earliest, you know, reports came from that. Miguel at the EPA wrote a memo that was documenting this and kind of suggesting that it's not just a problem at this one house, it's got to be a citywide problem because we know all these other issues with the treatment. But that was deflected and pushed down, and so yes, the idea came up with the help of an ACLU guy, you know, he's like, oh, maybe we can get some funding to get more and better data. If the city's tests aren't reliable, maybe we can get more and better data. And with the help of a team at Virginia Tech that was led by Mark Edwards, and working with community residents to do a lot of the collection and outreach and so on. They got samples that were very scientifically done, you know, like that are better, had a protocol that was like, I would say better than what most cities are doing, you know, like evenly distributed across neighborhoods, you know, 3 different samples instead of 1 quick flush, you know, like it's just, you know, they sealed them in boxes that were considered tamper-proof in hopes, because they anticipated, and it became true, that people would accuse them of faking it. They sent them to Virginia Tech, which tested them and was on kind of a blog sort of in real time giving updates. These samples, of which they sent out 300, they got back like 277, which is a remarkable rate of return. And yeah, it showed what we know now, like this like citywide lead crisis.
And we should say, and most people in here probably know this, but talk about the effects lead can have on children.
Yeah, it's pretty bad for both children and adults, but especially children,
kids,
because like they're developing, right? Lead would be a wonderful, wonderful material if it weren't like toxic to people. It's really a shame. It's like so useful for so many things. But it's, yeah, so with kids, like especially like when they ingest it, either, you know, like maybe it's in the water in their baby formula. Maybe they suck on a paint chip or something. They can intake it in a number of ways. It's in their blood, and then it is eventually gets into their like brains and bones. And this is one reason why people say it's like incurable. Like once it's there, it can't really kind of get it out. It stays there. It can cause a number of you know, like brain development issues, social development issues. A lot of it is late emerging, you know, it can impulse control, kidney damage, nerve damage. It has a number of both physical, mental, and emotional consequences that stay with you, that can stay with you for the rest of your life. It's no amount of lead is safe, and in children who absorb it almost like calcium's absorbed, like it just gets in your bones, you know. It's like and it just sits there kind of like a ticking time bomb, you know, that like as Dr. Mona, who's like a pediatrician who played a role in Flint, says like it's sort of like a kind of kryptonite, it just diminishes your powers. It just diminishes your abilities.
That's another name that I want to explore with you, Dr. I think it's Mona Hannah Atisha, who's a pediatrician at a hospital in Flint. She ends up going back and looking at a lot of research on kids who've been tested for lead in their blood. Talk for a moment about her role, if you would.
Sure. Yeah, so this is, we're in like late summer 2015 right now. This like Virginia Tech test was out there. This memo from the EPA guy was out there. Basically, there's more authoritative, what we consider authoritative voices validating what people in the community had been saying all along. So the tenor of this water question is changing significantly. But, you know, they were still kind of, no change seemed forthcoming. You know, there still seemed to be a lot of like belittlement, even of these kind of more recognized experts. What was needed basically was to show not just that there is an alarming amount of lead in the water, but that it is unfortunately causing actual harm to people, like kids are getting poisoned. And so what happened is that, you know, the pediatrician who worked at a hospital in Flint was able to access kids' records, and with the help of a couple other folks, you know, kind of put this together, you know, in a way that showed that yes, since the water switch, these levels have been rising, that more and more people are being hurt.
And her evidence and Mark Edwards' evidence was always questioned, almost without exception, by environmental authorities in Michigan, who raised concerns about whether they were trying to inflame the situation, they were doing this for their own personal advancement. I have to tell you, that's the one thing in the book that just still stays with me, is why the people who were in positions to really do something about this resisted so strongly. Is there a simple answer for that?
It's such a good question, and I still think about it because it's frightening, right? Like you want to think that if there's a public health emergency and a compounding amount of information that documents and validates that, and a public health emergency that gets worse the longer you wait, you know, that people, especially the people who work at our environmental agencies, our public servants, are going to do their jobs, like are going to, like, you know, step in and change things. I mean, I have a lot of theories, and I'm sure you guys do too, and honestly, I think it's like worth talking about more in a lot of ways, but I think there is a number of things going on. I think, you know, I think people just in general, and especially when in the context of institutions, have a hard time admitting that they're wrong. Like once they put themselves out there and said it's like safe and fixable, people feel shame if they go back on that. If they say, especially when they built that argument on implying, if not outright saying that like the people who disagree with us are stupid and don't know what they're talking about, which was a lot of what was suggested about the community in Flint. I think there's a lot of, I think there's actually like a note of laziness in it too. Like it was to reverse course would have been deeply complicated. I think people just thought they could just kind of try to ride this out, and you know, and maybe they have fifth class water, but it's good enough for them for now, which relates to another idea. I mean, there's just no getting around the fact that this is a community that is disproportionately poor, disproportionately people of color. We were talking a little bit ago, I mean, it was a Democratic city in a city that had, or a state that had like sole Republican leadership. I think there was fewer people with power in the state government who felt accountable to them. I think it's important to note that it wasn't just like the state agencies who didn't take this seriously soon enough. I think also other journalists and myself, you know, should have been there sooner and done more. I think other like environmental groups other universities, including our in-state universities, might have played a role, including the University of Michigan, which has a Flint campus. There's a lot of folks, I think, who had opportunities to intervene and did not. And I think, and another piece of this too is I think that given Flint's extremely difficult half century and running, I think there was a little bit of a sense that this was just one more problem among many. When everything's an emergency, nothing's an emergency. There's so many things that were challenging in Flint, like public safety and schools and other kinds of infrastructure that are breaking down. Literal life and death stuff, you know? I mean, the city is on the ropes in so many ways. The fact that there's like some discolored water and, you know, some complaints of rashes, just add it to the pile. Like, it's just like, it was hard for one emergency to like rise to the top. And then finally, I think it was just hard for us, and me and others, I would imagine, like to just get your mind around the scope of this, you know? It's terrifying to think that like the water that we're drinking can hurt us, and as it turned out to be the case, even kill people. Like that's so terrifying.
I want to talk about that with you too, because again, probably a lesser known part of the Flint story. So eventually, even though going back and reversing your decision and going back to Detroit Water was kind of a hassle, they did it.
They did. It turned out it was possible.
They did do it, but the story didn't end there. Then the governor, Rick Snyder, declares a state of emergency in early, was it 2016?
Yeah. There's an interesting, can I just pause? There's an interesting gap. Like they finally, after the doctor released the results, there's some more hemming and hawing. There was a really important free press report that like showed that the state was even misreading its own numbers. Basically, the house of cards fell. They announced that they are going to switch back to Detroit Water. They did so within 2 weeks. Cool. They started releasing some water filters. Great. That was a huge win. That was actually, nobody thought that could happen. That isn't true. It seemed very unlikely that could happen. People worked really hard for it and made it happen. And then there was this weird 3 to 4 month gap. It wasn't until January of 2016 that this sort of rose up in the national spotlight, and one might say, not coincidentally, the states of emergency were declared and much more resources were brought to this, and there was another announcement.
and the announcement was that actually there had been a Legionnaires outbreak, 2 Legionnaires outbreaks, during the course of the time that they had made the switch to the Flint water supply.
Coincidentally.
But people died from this.
People died from this. This is, so Legionnaires' disease is, it's a kind of really serious form of pneumonia, and you contract it by breathing in, it's like from a waterborne bacteria, and you breathe it in like in vapors, like in a shower, a bath, or washing dishes or something like that. So there had been this like long-running outbreak. It peaks in the summer, like it likes hot water best, and also people use water more in the summer. It had not been made public. No information about this had been made public, not to residents, not to medical professionals, not to the people who are more vulnerable to this, including those with compromised immune systems and older folks and all that, people who might have taken precautions. The official numbers is that over these like couple years that they say that like 90 people were sickened and 12 additional ones died. Many believe, and I think there's a lot of reasons to believe this, including other researchers, and PBS has been doing some investigation on this, that those numbers are much lower than they actually are because people, given that this wasn't public, weren't testing for it. They weren't looking for it. A lot of Legionnaire's diseases is often misdiagnosed as pneumonia. So that's out there.
Yeah, I don't want to. One thing I want to make clear is that some of what we're talking about is not a political view of what happened. This was found in a bipartisan commission that was appointed by Governor Snyder,
right.
who the commission basically came back and said what? They said a lot of mistakes were made.
Tons, and they put the bulk of the responsibility on the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality. It pointed to a number of things, and it was a bipartisan commission, brought together by the Republican governor. People weren't totally sure what was going to come out of it, but they did do quite a thorough investigation. And, they pointed to contributing factors like the emergency manager law, like just like long-term disinvestment in this community that created genuinely impossible choices. And yeah, and it put most of the responsibility on our environmental agency for supervising this switch, for not intervening sooner, for failing to ensure that this community was having safe drinking water, and not taking any responsibility for it until they were, forced to, and even then quite grudgingly.
So let's talk about Flint today for a couple of minutes, because there are a couple other things I want to touch on with you before we take audience questions. So Flint today, they're back on the Detroit water, my understanding is, but a lot of people still drink bottled water, don't they?
They do, and frankly, when I go to the city, I do too.
Even though the other water is supposed to be safe now.
Right, so, and this, God, there's so much with this. It switched back to Detroit water officially in October of 2015. It was said at the time that given the damage to the pipes, it would take a while to build back that scale. Eventually, that protective scale, but eventually, because of a class action settlement, the state has begun replacing the pipes, right? Like a lot of people are like, I'm not going to drink the water until this damaged lead-based infrastructure is totally gone. And that process is still happening. Many pipes have been replaced. There are many more yet to do it. There's untold complications with even figuring out where they are and how do we extract them, and it's an ongoing drama. But like they won't fully be replaced for a couple more years, and that. Like a lot of folks, I'm kind of the stance that even though safer water is moving through those pipes, even if you're in a place that does have a new pipe, you just generally want, materials move, like you just want the infrastructure to be like wholly changed. Also, I think a lot of residents, have just lost a lot of trust among the people who are responsible for the water. So even though there's this new water source, which is great, it is safer, and even if they have like water filters, that are certified for lead, they're just kind of like, first of all, lead isn't the only thing that they were concerned about. There was a number of problems. And second of all, the people who are monitoring it now, the people who are assuring them it's safe now, are the same institutions that said it was safe before. So, the people who broke it, and not even necessarily the exact same people, because they're not all in their jobs anymore, but like the people who broke it are the ones who are frustrated with people not using the water as much as they used to. The state did stop giving, they do bottled water distribution sites that ended in April, very abruptly. But yeah, a lot of folks have resorted to, they're kind of going back to the old days, doing their own bottled water distribution.
Talk about the lack of trust. So there have been indictments. There have been more than a dozen people indicted in connection with this crisis. But nobody's gone to prison yet, have they?
No, and I think this is also like the conclusion of all these cases may be a long time to come. It was, so again, it wasn't until the national spotlight came that the Attorney General announced that there would be a criminal investigation. 15 people were indicted, most of them people who worked for the state, the environmental agency, and also our health and human service agency, a couple of emergency managers. Many have since, it's just a number in just the last few weeks, accepted plea deals.
Contest.
Yeah, right.
Jail time, yeah.
And there's others who are still moving through their preliminary examinations. There's two of the highest level people who were charged who have received judgments that there's enough evidence to go on to trial. They were still actively serving in their jobs. They weren't even suspended with pay, which is remarkable, I think. And there's a couple of other civil lawsuits going on too. Now, we just had a huge political transition. So there's a new attorney general. The attorney general's office had a special prosecutor that was, leading this. There's new leadership regarding this. So one of the questions I have as a journalist and just as a citizen, I'm curious about where things are going to go next, like how this criminal investigation might be expanded or changed, or where things are going. I mean, there was I think a lot of people believed that there needed to be some kind of accountability in our justice system for what happened here because it seemed so just clearly egregiously wrong. But they are extremely complicated cases, and it had another complexity because the Attorney General was also, I mean, he's been running for governor since he was 2, and he did not get elected governor. There was a lot of speculation, there was a lot of frustration. People wondered if like this was kind of a one big campaign move and less a genuine investigation. Anyway, we have some fresh people in there, so we'll see what happens next.
Yeah, you've touched on a couple things, and one of them I'd like to ask you about. You touched on the fact that it's undeniable that in Flint, it's a largely poor city, a largely minority city, and that there is that undercurrent of race and maybe how seriously some of the complaints of citizens with what degree they were being handled, how seriously they were being handled. But you've also touched on the issue of infrastructure, and this is a question I think for a Milwaukee audience. Why should places like Milwaukee, Racine, Wausau, Green Bay, Beloit, cities that have lead pipes, why should we be concerned about what happened in Flint?
Because as much as we'd like to believe that what happened in Flint is a singular story, it's truly not. It's just not. This is a borrowed comparison, but folks know of the infamous Cuyahoga River Fire of 1969. Now, that river fire outside Cleveland, it wasn't the first time a river caught fire because it was so polluted. It wasn't even the first time that river caught fire. But for some reason, that was the moment that galvanized people where they're like, this isn't okay, like maybe we should be treating our urban waterways better. Maybe we should have some limits on what we can dump into it. And a few years later, we had the Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act, and things really changed. We had an EPA. That didn't happen. We didn't have one at the time. The comparison I'm kind of borrowing from another person. He's just that there's that the Flint water crisis could be a kind of Cuyahoga River fire. It could be we have lead pipes everywhere. We have a number of drinking water issues everywhere, especially but not only in disinvested cities. Perhaps what happened in Flint can be a wake-up call for us to realize that it's not just this wild thing that happened in this one place. It is part of a pattern, and we have to reckon with that in our own communities.
We should point out the state of Michigan has paid or is paying for the replacement of lead pipes.
It is,
in Flint. That is uncommon, generally speaking.
And they were forced to, right? It was a lawsuit. It was a class action settlement. It wasn't like they just opted in.
It is possible to replace lead pipes. I'm sure people from the city would tell you that it would cost hundreds of millions of dollars to do that in the city of Milwaukee. But the city of Madison has replaced lead pipes. The city of Lansing, Michigan has replaced lead pipes. How did they do it?
Yeah, and
because the cost is enormous.
They didn't even wait for this huge shaming emergency to do so. It's a miracle. After what happened in Flint, at least I was talking to some folks who were involved with how Lansing did it, and they were getting calls all over the country what do you do? I mean, our pipes are so old that people don't, they don't even know where they are, let alone how to find the money to replace them. And cities are strapped. I mean, for a lot of reasons. I get it. And especially the infrastructure that's underground, it's easy to forget about. It's not necessarily the thing that voters or other residents are calling their council people about. At least in Michigan, we can't even get our roads right, let alone the thing we're not, looking at all the time. It is a challenge. And where does the money come from, right? That's what the cities of Lansing and Michigan, Lansing and Madison did it in different ways. One thing that Lansing was able to do is they just built it into, they had an advantage, because one of the challenges with lead pipes is that they're often publicly owned for part of it and privately owned for the other part of it. So that's, what do you do with that? And partial line replacements make the problem worse. You shouldn't do them. We've learned that. It causes an uptick in lead by just shaking the whole pipe up. So if you're going to replace it, you got to replace all of it. A lot of municipalities would prefer not to just do the whole thing. They would like residents to pay for their portion of the pipe. not least to bring the cost down. In Lansing, they had the advantage that they didn't need to deal with that just because of how they own the infrastructure. So they just like built things in over about 10 years, and they went a little bit over their timeline, but they did do it, and most people didn't even notice it was happening. Like, they got more efficient at it as they went because they built skills. They developed this clever little tool to get the pipes out without digging huge trenches and just making everybody mad. A lot of times when they would knock on someone's door to like do the last hookup, they would be met by residents who are like, wait, what's going on? Is there a problem? They're like, no, I'm just doing, preventative maintenance, and they're like shocked because it's so unusual. They assume if somebody's doing something with the pipes, it's because there's an emergency. The idea that somebody would just, make things better because it's the right thing to do is not our pattern. Madison I'm less familiar with, but I know they did receive, some financing from the state, and they're able to work this out as well. And both of them show that there are blueprints for how to do this, but how do we scale it up, right? And I think there's just no getting around the fact that, having federal and state support for cities is crucial. A lot of cities can't do this on their own. Michigan, in the wake of Flint, one law it passed is to get the lead pipes out of every municipality within 20 or 30 years, but it's totally unfunded, which is, so it's a great goal, but a lot of utilities are very understandably how are we supposed to even deal with that, how are we supposed to just put that on the water customers? Are we supposed to just, that for a lot of places, dealing with expensive bills like Flint was, that's just untenable. On the other hand, somebody's got to pay for this financially, or we're all going to continue to pay for this in our public health.
We should say, and I'll take questions now, we should say that it'll be interesting to see what happens in Wisconsin, for instance, because last night the governor said in his first State of the State speech that water quality was going to be an issue for him, that he would address it in some way in the budget, so we'll see what's contained in the budget. He did mention lead specifically, so we'll see what happens with that. If you have a question for Anna Clark, and you're seated in the bowl here, please press down on that little black thing in front of you and hold your finger down on it so we can hear your question. If you're seated in the back, wait for Ryan to come over. He will hold the mic in front of you and you can ask a question. As we always do, we urge people just to keep their questions brief, concise as possible, no speeches, if that's okay. Although I know this issue can be, kind of emotional for people. We'll start here with this gentleman.
So I'm a little confused. When the switch was made from the lake to the river, the water is still going through the same lead pipes, and the poison is the lead. So
why did it change?
Yeah, right. What am I missing here?
Yeah, there's two key things. One is that when the city took responsibility for treating the water itself, and again, to be clear, it was a city that didn't have the power, its own powers. It was really a state-run switch. It didn't treat the water with corrosion control as the Detroit water system treated it. So without adding this particular chemical into it, it first of all was breaking federal law before anything happened, but also failed to keep the pipes safe. Plus, it was exacerbated, it was made worse by the fact that this new water source, a river, is just more corrosive than a lake is naturally. So, so you have a more corrosive water source going through those old pipes, and the water that's going through them is no longer treated with corrosion control, which led to an ongoing breakdown of them.
Any questions in the back? Yes, sir.
In the introduction or the acknowledgments, you mentioned one of your reviewers or editors wanted more chapters. What's the chapter that didn't get written, or the next chapter or chapters? What's next?
Oh gosh, that's so, that's such a good question. I wish I had more time for so many reasons. One is that the story is literally still unfolding, and I knew when I started this that I wasn't going to be able to end the book with some sort of satisfying slam of the jail door and then we got him, there's a lot of unanswered questions. And if I had more time and more space, I would love to devote it to following a little bit more what this accountability question looks like, and specifically what happened in Flint, but also in a broader way. Like when it comes to environmental injustices, it's a challenging point. Like how do you might know, for example, it might be very evident that if the neighborhood that lives right next to some toxic dump is having twice the percentage rates of cancer than they ordinarily would have, right? But it's also nearly impossible to prove that any one specific person's cancer came from it, because some of it might have been chance. Some of it might have been genetics, some of it might have been some other thing, And so I'm trying to wrestle a little bit more with how we deal with patterns and in acknowledging them while also trying to make things right with individuals. I would love to explore that more and find out more like what other models are for that, what we can learn about and how we structure our communities in a way that can adapt to the way these environmental justices work, i.e. being invisible oftentimes, like lead, like you can't see it exactly, and playing out over long periods of time, where there's no like maybe one particular person who is solely responsible, like nobody's like pouring poison in the water. There's a number of decisions and choices there. Anyway, it's a complicated question, but it's also something we can't elide because clearly a wrong happened here. Like it's chilled us to this whole nation, like to our core. You watch what happened here, and it's and it seems to cut against so much of what we, so much of our like beliefs of how we should be as a people. That we have to have some way, I think, of being able to account for it, to have accountability for that, both to make things right for the city, but also to help keep something similar from happening elsewhere. Anyway, that's just something I think I would love to take further. They made me turn it in. I had to stop.
Happens when you write a book. Stop, please stop. We'll go over here and we'll try and get to a couple more. Yes, sir. This gentleman right there, Ryan.
I think we all share your frustration and Mr. Gaucher's question about like how can this happen when you have this overwhelming evidence and so forth. But do you agree this is kind of the human condition, is that the Me Too movement is like, no, that can't be, and blah, blah, blah. You have to have this overwhelming evidence. You have Auschwitz or concentration camps. No, that didn't happen. We didn't do that. So, I mean, it's a little bit on, just as you said, there's a perfect storm of all the things that had happened and Crying Wolf and everything in Flint already in the mix. But the psychological principle of cognitive dissonance is when we have something we completely believe in, and then that gets challenged, there's so much of a threat to ourselves, or shame, or we're so stupid. But I think the key thing is we don't have any other template to replace it with. So we're taking away this thing that was our standard of thinking about something, and now we have to have something else, but we have nothing else to replace it with. So I just wonder if that was one of the factors amongst 500 other ones that you mentioned that was accounting for that. And
Sure.
does in all these situations that are in the press so often.
Yeah, I love how you're able to kind of like make that connection between these other sort of, when things happen, it seems so like monstrous, being able to look at it in a micro way and try to figure out how that happened, and be able to see how that happens in like many different realms, because there's something that's it's signaling to us that there's something about our patterns of human behavior that lead to this, right? And being more aware of it, I think, can help us notice when we're in the middle of such a situation and hopefully find the right way to get through it. I mean, I think the good news about Flint, and actually, what you were saying too about like Me Too and like the Holocaust, it's like there are people who do make the right choices. They are there. They might not be most of them, and they might not be the people with the most power, but there are people who keep their wits about them and did make the right choice when it came to them, despite sometimes incredible odds, and despite not necessarily understanding totally what was going on, not necessarily having all the information. That kind of stuff gives me some amount of like courage and hope, kind of going forward, because it shows that first of all, it's possible. Second of all, it gives us a little bit of little, like sort of like how-to, models for those of us who might find ourselves in tricky situations, if we're working at some kind of institution, for example, and we're beginning to feel sort of uncomfortable with what's going on, or, like there are people who went before us who were in similarly tight straits, and they figured out how to way to do it. And not least, I want to just emphasize again, like the folks in the community of Flint who got every message possible that what they thought was happening and what they cared about did not matter, to the point that they didn't have the power of their local government for nearly 4 years, more than 4 years, really. They were told in policy, through policy, as well as directly to their faces, that they were not what they could see with their own eyes, nobody cared about, and they're wrong. And yet still, they made this happen. They made this a thing that we're reckoning with with Flint itself, and it's also something that communities all over the country are learning from.
Let me try and get one more question. Anybody over here on the left and on this side of the room? I haven't gotten over here. Yeah, go ahead, please.
I'd like a little bit more information about what Mark Edwards' role was there. The reason I ask this is when he was here, he told us that Milwaukee's water was actually worse than Flint's. But yet he has become kind of a controversial figure with some of the people who are trying to do some things about the lead. And I'm just wondering if you can shed any light.
Sure, yeah. So folks may or may not know like the kind of whole story with the Virginia Tech professor who led a lot of this. Even before Flint, he was played a really significant role in the Washington, D.C. lead and water crisis that had gone on for several years. I didn't even know about until just a few years ago. But it was a very serious drinking water emergency that was playing out in our nation's capital, and did not get the kind of recognition that even Flint got for a number of reasons. So he had gotten like a MacArthur Genius Grant, acknowledging the kind of work he did there. He really is one of the nation's experts on corrosion and lead and stuff like that. He's worked all over the country, working with communities and dealing with a lot of these issues. And he is a pretty controversial figure too. And I think people have different reasons for believing that. He is a bit of a firebrand. And it's both, personally I would say it's probably his greatest strength and greatest weakness is that he's, very assertive when he thinks other people are wrong, because some people, in some cases, the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, they're wrong, and having very strong, clear, informed voices, acknowledging all that is can play a really powerful role in bringing bringing us to a more just outcome. On the other hand, I think that, I think there's been a very frayed relationship between, at least, I don't know as much about Milwaukee, but between Flint and him, and it's devolved to the point where there's he's filed lawsuits against 3 people, one of whom's a Flint mother who is one of the key organizers here for defamation. There's other folks researchers who've been investigating the Legionnaires' crisis, and he's working very hard to bring kind of break that down, kind of saying all the things that he thinks that they're doing wrong. I don't know. He's a challenging person, and some of his tactics I think can be are pretty bullying.
I did want to just, because I moderated the panel that Professor Edwards was on, I just want to be fair. I don't want to be a defense for the city of Milwaukee, but he did also say that because Milwaukee was using corrosion control, that it was doing things that Flint wasn't doing, and that it was not disrupting lines when it was trying to replace lines. So he commended the city for that. So I don't want to make it seem like our water is worse than Flint's. I want to be clear on that. You may disagree with me, but I just want to make sure that we're kind of all on the same page on that. Before we go, I did want to ask you one, because this is a fascinating part of this story. You wonder why this stuff didn't become more public, why we didn't know more about the internal communications that were going on between environmental officials and other folks. This is an incredible part of the book, and it deals with transparency. Michigan is not required to make public a lot of the emails. Things you would have to make public in the state of Wisconsin, they don't have to do.
Right, right. So Michigan.
One of two states.
Michigan is one of only two states where both the governor's office, executive office, and the legislature are exempt from open records laws. Journalists in the state have been complaining about this for many years. One of the Virginia Tech professors' great strengths is he knows the power of open records and bringing clarity to how and why things happen. Would there have been a response sooner to what happened in Flint if citizens and journalists and advocates and their professional allies had been able to have access to some more of that documentation sooner about the decisions and the treatment and all that and the emails? Maybe. Either way, but whether or not that's for sure, it's one of what I consider the still unresolved reforms that that are still pending in the wake of Flint. I think the governor did release some emails under great pressure, but there was all opt-in. There's no real accountability if it's all of it. It's just we need more transparency. I think that's clear if we're going to have just, safe, and inclusive communities.
And the other state that isn't transparent?
It's Massachusetts. That's what I said.
So I want to take a moment before we go to let you know that Anna Clark's book, The Poison City, is available for sale out in the lobby. I don't know if she's going to have a chance to personally sign it. She may not. She's got an interview with Susan Benz from WWM coming up, and then she has two more events. We're getting our money's worth out of Anna today, but I just want to thank everybody who showed up on this snowy day. I know the weather wasn't great, but we're delighted that all of you came here today and spent some time with us and had a chance to hear more about Anna's important work. I do want to say one thing. We still have some seats available for our event tomorrow. We are releasing the latest Marquette Law School poll. It has a lot of interesting questions about policy issues for the state of Wisconsin, about the 2020 presidential race, about the president's performance, even the government shutdown. Lots of interesting stuff in it. So I hope maybe a few of you will find time over the lunch hour to wander over and join us. Again, thanks so much for being with us today, and thanks mostly to Anna Clark. Anna,
Thank you, everybody. This is lovely.